Welcome to the Diesel Podcast presented by DFC Diesel. Stewart, welcome back to the Diesel Podcast. We meet again to talk about emissions and deletes and some major news that's been happening over the last couple months that I know you'll be able to provide some clarity on that our listeners and myself are confused about, wondering what's going on. So welcome back to the podcast.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. As always, it's always good to sit down and talk to you about what's going on in my world, and that includes the legal landscape that we have going on today.
It seems like, well, it doesn't seem, a lot has changed. I think since we talked last, over the last couple months, I saw a gentleman in Wyoming get a pardon for deletes. I know you have a client that had a major update or change in their case. A lot of things are being, we're seeing things more in the public eye as it relates to that. So I wanted to chat with you about and maybe we start with like the pardon, which was huge
Sure.
news, and then talk about the case that you were involved in and some changes with that, and then just see where things are standing with deletes, enforcement, criminal cases, those sorts of things.
Yeah, that sounds great. So we'll start with our friend Troy Lake, who is the person who received a pardon from President Trump. Troy is a diesel mechanic, and he has a shop that's now based in Wyoming, but previously it was based in Colorado. And he was charged with conspiracy to violate the Clean Air Act in I want to say it was 2024 or something like that. And what happened was there were a bunch of companies that had either purchased tunes or gotten trucks worked on by him. And the Department of Justice and the EPA had approached those other companies, and they had asked those companies basically to cooperate against Troy. And when they asked him to cooperate against Troy, the lower level vehicle shops and truck owners and fleet owners, they ended up getting what we call corporate pleas. So there was no individual liability or no individual felony charges against those guys, but they all kind of cooperated, and the DOJ really threw the book at Troy. And so Troy decided back when he entered his plea to plead guilty to conspiracy to violate the Clean Air Act. And the judge here in Colorado sentenced him to 12 months and 1 day in prison. And it was a very severe penalty for even a person who has done a lot of deletes, in my opinion. There's only been a small handful of people in the US who have actually gone to prison for this. I'd say less than 10 total. And a lot of those people have aggravating factors that would contribute to their behavior, like, IRS tax liens or a prior criminal history, things that were not really present in Troy's case. So Troy did his time. He was in prison for approximately 7 months, and then he was released. And when he was released, he got hooked up with a gentleman by the name of Jeff Doherty, who I've been working with closely. He's a great guy. He's based out of Cheyenne, Wyoming. And Jeff really advocated strongly with the Trump administration and with the U.S. attorney's offices to try to get Troy Lake a pardon. And the reason that we believed, or that Jeff believed, that he qualified for a pardon was because the Department of Justice and the federal legal system and the US government had been weaponized against him, and that the punishment didn't fit the crime, and that if he was going to be a felon for the rest of his years in Wyoming or Colorado or wherever he and his family decide to live, that wouldn't be an equitable result for his case, because even though he may have sold deletes and he may have technically violated the law, he was really being punished in a way that was disproportionate to his crime. And so Jeff helped coordinate a pardon application with Troy, and President Trump looked at the pardon application and he determined that Troy was eligible for a pardon and should receive a pardon, and that's what happened. So Troy has gotten a pardon for his felony conviction, which has now been vacated. And what Troy is doing now is he is in contact with lawyers and shops around the country to try to help them potentially get a pardon for, the weaponization of the government that they've suffered from. And, I've had several phone calls with Troy and his wife, and they're just wonderful, wonderful family, wonderful people, and I was really happy that he got the pardon.
There's a lot of questions I want to ask you. I think in an article I read about it, was his prison term served in Florence, Colorado?
Uh, I believe so.
Which I think when I read that, just to my limited knowledge, isn't that don't the worst of the worst go there in the federal prison system?
I think the worst of the worst go to Canyon City,
Okay.
and like the Supermax. That's where like El Chapo and Ted Kaczynski are. And I don't know if they've got like a bunch of facilities down there, so they might have like a minimum security and a maximum security and a supermax. But yeah, whatever it wasn't a very pleasant experience. I'm sure of that.
I think that was what was so shocking because the article I read, it wasn't, and we've talked about this on the podcast before, the level of Clean Air Act violations in our conversations, it seemed to be hit or miss whether you do 5, 10, or 5,000. Sometimes they don't line up with how the cases are approached. And from what I had read of his,
Yeah.
it wasn't like 5 or 10,000 or 100,000 of these. It was a very
No.
small amount.
No, I mean he tuned more than 20 trucks, but we're not talking about, tens of thousands of defeat tunes for sure. And we're definitely not talking about the same impact on the environment that like an OEM would have, like Volkswagen or Fiat Chrysler or one of these big companies that really game the system. And one of the big arguments that we've been making to the DOJ and to the US attorney's offices around the country are you guys are charging people for tuning 10, 15, 20, 100 trucks with individual felonies, but you have, companies that are doing real damage to the environment on the OEM side, like Cummins, and those companies never had any individual charges brought, except if it was for a foreign national. So Volkswagen had a couple German guys who were charged by the DOJ, and then they were extradited to Germany. And then I believe that Fiat Chrysler had an Italian guy who was charged, and he was extradited to Italy. But like the consistency of the enforcement has always been a drum that I've been beating on. Number one, are these civil cases or are they criminal cases? It's always been our position that, this is not the intention of the Clean Air Act was to charge individual violators with felonies, that's a lawsuit, right? And, the second thing is whether or not the enforcement is consistent. Why should a guy who tuned 10,000 vehicles or sold 10,000 tunes receive a civil penalty when a guy who owns a fleet and he tuned 15 trucks in the fleet and he didn't manufacture the tunes, why is he being charged with a felony? So we're seeing some real headway on that argument with the administration and with U.S. attorneys' offices around the country. And the real headway that we're seeing with that argument is that the argument that the government has been weaponized against people who are blue collar guys, who are conservative guys, and they are having to plead guilty to felony charges because they can't afford to defend themselves is very attractive argument to make to the Trump administration because the Trump administration has got a lot of conservative supporters and blue collar supporters, and Trump wants to protect his supporters. And so when we make arguments to the office of the Deputy Attorney General, or we make arguments to various US attorneys around the country, we will see that appointed or acting US attorneys who have been appointed by President Trump are a lot more receptive to these weaponization arguments that we believe have been true for the last 5 years.
Hey, Diesel fans, we want to give a shout out to our friends over at Kershaw Knives. They have a 20% off code. So if you add some knives to your cart, add code 20 TDP 2026, you get 20% off of MSRP. It's a great way to save some money, get some cool gear if you're in the market for a new EDC knife, something for hunting, fishing, around the job site, around the house. They've got you covered with a bunch of different choices for blade steel, blade shape, different handle designs, different opening mechanisms, and their whole lineup's designed to meet any budget that you might have. So if you're in the market, head on over to Kershaw.kaiusa.com. Use code 20 TDP 2026 and get 20% off your cart. Is that weaponization? Is that kind of the foundation of it? Which I guess with that pardon, that was the major. One of the major parts of it was that it was weaponized against him. Is it that you do 10 or 15 and you get the book thrown at you versus somebody does 5 or 10,000 and they don't?
Well, I think the weaponization argument is partially that argument, but I think at its core, the weaponization argument is that the US government should not be going around charging people with felonies for what are either minor infractions of the Clean Air Act or another environmental statute, or they are not consistent with across the board. So you have people who have done way more tunes who, in theory, have done way more damage to the environment, and those people are being charged with they're under a civil investigation. But then you get other people who have the full weight of the Department of Justice thrown at them because they may have technically violated a law that the EPA or the DOJ interprets a certain way. So once we start to make progress on this weaponization argument, the goal really is to get legislation with the US, with Congress, where the people who have violated the law understand why it is that they may be subject to a felony or not. Because if you have two people running a shop and they're doing the exact same thing, and one of them is charged with a felony and they have to go through the criminal justice system, and one of them is subject to a fine, that's not fair and that's not equitable. And we need some consistent enforcement of the rules, which I've been talking about on your podcast for years. We need some consistent enforcement of the rules to really make some headway on what it means to violate the Clean Air Act and who might be responsible for what types of violations.
I think that's where, like myself, a lot of listeners, people are watching this or listening to it, where they get passionate about this is we think that there's equal application of the law. And when we see that there is an inequality in how it's applied, people get emotional and get very opinionated on it. And I've always been very confused with that in either chatting with you about specific examples or guests that I've had on is, you know, sometimes I'm talking about a fine, sometimes somebody's going away to federal prison for 6 months or their life is drastically changing. And so it doesn't seem to be, there doesn't seem to be a way that you can discern that it's being applied the same way, you know, irregardless. I think that's where a lot of confusion and a lot of opinions that I read on like YouTube and things like that come from, is they just don't understand, why is this person going to federal prison?
Yeah.
But I read about, you know, this OEM that did millions of vehicles or hundreds of thousands of vehicles, and it's a, you know, it's a fine.
Well, you can talk to the people who enforce the laws, the EPA's Criminal Investigation Division, or the FBI, or the U.S. Attorney's offices in various different areas of the country. And they'll tell you that in their opinion, it relates to intent. Like, did this person know that they weren't supposed to do deletes? And did this person do it anyway? And did they intend to violate the law? Did they intend to make a lot of money? Okay. I mean, if a mens rea, which is the mental state that's necessary to create a crime, is required to charge under the Clean Air Act, then fine. I could understand that. The problem is that everybody really knows that doing it is wrong. It's the level of culpability related to them doing it that is almost impossible to determine. And I can tell you, I've had some civil clients who have made millions of dollars, who were well aware that what they were doing was wrong, and they were under a civil enforcement. And I've had some criminal clients who genuinely had no clue that anything that they were doing was wrong, because in the areas of the country where they live, everybody is doing deletes. And yeah, they have an idea they maybe are not supposed to be doing them, but everybody's doing it. And so what's really the harm? And then they get popped with a criminal enforcement. So the mental state and the intent argument doesn't really hold water across the board. And I'm saying that as somebody who is situated. I know about most every single major case that's happened in this country, and the different types of circumstances and aggravators associated with those cases. And I can tell you, there is not a common thread between all criminal cases or all civil cases. There's not. I've represented guys who have been accused of deleting 11 vehicles in federal criminal court. I have also represented guys who have deleted 10,000 vehicles in a civil enforcement. And to me, based on the facts that I know, there's absolutely no difference between those parties besides the number of tunes that they've done.
I definitely want to get to talking about some specific examples of changes with the criminal side, but I wanted to ask you about one particular portion of this before we jump over. Is I think it's really important. Like when I read the news about the pardon and some of these other things, it seemed like a major shift and change from the conversations we had in 2019 till now. But you touched on the political aspect of it, and whether it's a pardon coming from the president or the types of attorneys that are out there who appoints them. That can change every 4 years. It can change every 8. The whole goal of everything can
Yeah.
change. So it kind of tempered my hope with this, or my optimism, because it could change in 4 years or it can change in 8, or whatever the time frame is. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of actually getting this in front of Congress and making concrete changes so that in it's 2025, in 2029 or 2030, you and I aren't sitting back down here again talking about how now it's criminal to do one of these, or
Yeah.
how it's changing. How important is that?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. And, tampering with emissions controls, whether it's on a diesel or on a gas motor, on a race car or a quasi race car that goes on the road, whether it's on a tractor, and we'll get to that, or something that, operates off road or on road. Tampering with emissions controls has always been illegal as long as there have been emissions controls on vehicles, all the way back to the 70s. Okay. The Clean Air Act provided that you were not allowed to tamper with emissions controls on mobile sources. The real question is whether or not that's a civil violation or a criminal violation. And I think that we've made some really good arguments in court that have not yet been decided yet. And when I say we, I mean the legal community. Um, when we have been going to court, we've made some really good argument as to why tampering on mobile sources is not a criminal violation. Okay. But the EPA's interpretation of the Clean Air Act is really suspect. And what they've said is that tampering with a monitoring device is a criminal activity under Title I of the Clean Air Act. But Title I of the Clean Air Act applies directly to stationary sources, and they have interpreted an OBD to be a monitoring device for purposes of creating a criminal charging theory in criminal court to say it's a felony. And the reason they did that, frankly, is because they weren't making a lot of headway stopping people from deleting vehicles on the civil side. Because everybody thought, oh, well, it's just fine. So, they weren't very deterred. So the EPA interpreted the law in this way, but they didn't go through the formal process of doing it the right way in order to codify or engage in a formal rulemaking to say that there is a criminal tampering violation for mobile sources for vehicles. Okay. And I think if we can get some clarification or some legislation related to whether or not mobile source tampering is a felony and why it may be a felony that goes beyond a EPA interpretation of the Clean Air Act, then I think there's going to be a lot more clarification in what a crime is versus what's not a crime. Like, for example, if I start a company online and I sell diesel defeat devices to third parties or to dealers or to end users, and I sell 100,000 parts, that's not a crime. That may be a civil violation, but that's not a crime. The sale of aftermarket defeat devices is not a felony. So why would that not be a crime? Why would that not be a felony? Whereas somebody who tampers with 10 fleet vehicles is a felony because they actually had their hands on the vehicle. Those are the questions that we need answered. And I think the way to do it is through a formal rulemaking policy or formal rulemaking procedure with Congress where the EPA can lay out their interpretation of the Clean Air Act. The public has the ability to provide a public comment on it, and then they can create a final rule that says tampering is illegal for these reasons. And that's about as close as we're going to. Are we going to get Congress to amend the Clean Air Act to say that mobile source tampering is legal or illegal? Almost definitely not. We can't get Congress to agree on healthcare. We can't get Congress to agree on guns rights. We can't get Congress to agree on the most rudimentary constitutional issues. So are we going to get Congress to weigh in on, on diesel tampering within the Clean Air Act? Probably not, but we can get pretty close. I'm confident we can get pretty close.
Something I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that because something I see a lot of is like with the ATF, when they propose a rule change, there'll be a public comment. It's very public when
Yes.
whether through news sources, social media influencers, you see a lot of it if you pay attention to that side of it. Does the EPA it operates differently as far as those rules? Like it's not as streamlined as the ATF when they want to propose changes.
No, it's the same. They just don't have the same resources as the ATF does. So the EPA underwent a formal rulemaking in 22 and 23. And in that formal rulemaking, under the Biden administration, they interpreted a bunch of other rules that would pertain to any kind of environmental legal aspect. And they addressed tampering in that formal rulemaking. But you know what they didn't do? They did not state in the formal rulemaking that mobile source tampering was a felony. So it's our view as the lawyers who are arguing these things to courts around the country, it's our view that the EPA, under a liberal administration, had their opportunity to really codify and clarify whether or not mobile source tampering was illegal in this rulemaking that happened in 2022 and 2023, and they didn't do it. So the rule, the informal rule that they're using now is invalid because they didn't go through the formal rulemaking process where you have to open it up for public comment.
Okay, that makes sense. To kind of pivot for a second, we've talked about the pardon and the kind of general shift in things, but you have a client in a case where it didn't even get that far. Like, tell me a bit about that case, what happened.
Yeah.
I think that'll connect it really well for us.
Yeah. So one of the things that we've seen around the country recently is that the Department of Justice is changing their focus away from environmental crimes and some of the other more left Democrat priorities to the priorities of the Trump administration, which would include cracking down on violent crime, cracking down on immigration, cracking down on illegal and dangerous drugs, cracking down on the importation of those illegal and dangerous drugs and things along those lines. Okay. So when the American public elected President Trump, he ran on the platform that he was going to do all the things that I just mentioned in order to make America safer in his mind. So, and I think definitely make America safer in general. But as part of the Trump administration's change from the Biden administration, President Trump appointed Pam Bondi to be the Attorney General, and she issued a bunch of executive orders and change in priorities for enforcement with the Department of Justice. And one of the things that they focused on was to end weaponization of the Department of Justice against American citizens and to promote American energy and to promote American businesses to be able to make money, to reduce regulations so that the economy can get better. Okay. And her directives have filtered down to acting or appointed U.S. attorneys around the country. And there, I don't know how many there are, but I want to say there's probably like 100 of them for 50 states, actual United States attorneys for their district. And those U.S. attorneys have priorities for their district. And under the Biden administration, Levi was investigated for violating the Clean Air Act. And he was investigated for conspiracy, and he was investigated for felony tampering, the same charges that we've talked about before. And we went back and forth with the DOJ, and we said, he's not doing this anymore. We would be willing to pay a fine. And they said, oh, no, this is a criminal violation. You must, if you want to move on with your life, then Levi is going to have to plead guilty to a felony, to 2 felonies, actually. Felony conspiracy to tamper under the Clean Air Act and felony tampering. And they said, we don't want Levi to go to jail, and we don't want him to get in all that much trouble, but in order to deter future behavior, he must plead guilty to these felonies. And so right at the end of the Trump administration, or I'm sorry, the end of the Biden administration, the beginning of the Trump administration, the U.S. attorneys and the EPA came to us with this deal. And I went to Levi and I said, look, man, like, we can fight this if you want, or you can plead guilty. It's up to you. What do you want to do? I know it's going to cost a lot of money to fight it. There's no guarantee you're going to succeed. The same thing that I tell all my clients. And he says, well, he said, I really don't want to plead guilty to a felony, but if I have to do that to get the EPA away from me and the DOJ away from me, then that's what I'll do. So he entered into a plea agreement with the DOJ in April of this year. So just the very beginning of the Trump administration. And he said, I'm willing to do this plea agreement as long as you're not going to give me a huge fine and you're not going to throw me in jail, which they agreed to. So we entered into the plea agreement. And then if you fast forward until September, they filed the plea agreement and they scheduled a court date so that Levi could enter a guilty plea. And when some people with the DOJ, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Wyoming, saw this pleading, they said, whoa, hold up a minute. This is not a priority of the Trump administration. What is this Clean Air Act violation? And they reached out to me, the U.S. Attorney's Office reached out to me, and they said, we are going to conduct a further investigation on Levi's case to determine whether or not we want to proceed. And I thought to myself, well, this has got to be a first, right? I have a, client who's agreed to felony plea in order to, get the government away from him and move on with his life. And they're actually going to go back and they're going to do the right thing. They're going to review the case and determine whether or not they believe that it is in the best interests of justice to pursue these charges against him. And we went back and forth with the U.S. Attorney's Office and the acting U.S. Attorney in Wyoming. His name is Darren Smith. At the end of the day, he determined that it would not be an appropriate use of the DOJ's resources, and it was not in the best interests of justice to pursue the claims, the charges against Levi. And so we got notice a couple weeks ago that they were going to drop the charges, but right before Thanksgiving, actually, that they were going to drop the charges against Levi and they were going to move on. So it was a really good day for Levi especially, but also for me and the people, the team who helped him with this negotiation. Because it was the first time, to my knowledge, in the United States that a U.S. attorney had evaluated a case based on the priorities of a previous administration in the Clean Air Act space and said, we don't think that these charges are appropriate under the new administration's priorities. So those charges were dismissed, and now Levi is, working to try his very best to, go out and advocate for other people whose cases have not been dismissed yet, of which there were many, many of those cases.
Do you think we're going to see more of that take place?
Around the country?
Yeah.
I think so. I think that there's going to be investigations which are halted. I think that there are going to be charges that are dismissed. I think that all of these U.S. attorneys around the country work for President Trump in the executive branch of the government. And when President Trump realizes that there's been dozens and dozens of individuals and companies who have been charged with violating the Clean Air Act and had the government weaponized against them, that he is going to give his U.S. attorney's offices leeway to dismiss those charges or stop those investigations. I'm not saying they're going to stop altogether. And I think I've been pretty clear about that on the podcast. I have several cases that are being investigated right now where I haven't received any word that those investigations are going to stop. So I would caution all your listeners to not do deletes because they're still definitely illegal in one way or another. But I do think that the weaponized group of people, the individuals who don't really deserve those felony charges, people like Levi and other people around the country, I think that the U.S. attorney's offices are going to start dismissing some of those cases.
It's one of the rare instances where we read or hear about these directives that kind of start at the presidential level and then they go down to the attorney general or other department heads, where we actually see a change in it. And I think from the outside looking in and paying attention to media, whether it's legacy media or podcasts or YouTube videos, we kind of operate on it's either or. Either it's full enforcement or no enforcement. And it really helps to
Yeah.
understand how it falls into the middle a little bit, because that's going to be one of the main things I think someone who's watching this is going to ask is, well, does it mean that all cases are just dropped now and there's no more criminal enforcement of it? That's where the confusion, because we're not lawyers, we're not constitutional scholars. We don't, our head's not in that room, all the
Yeah.
time to even know, but that's where we get confused a little bit is, are they all going to be stopped or how's it going to unfold?
Well, they're not all going to be stopped unless there is a specific directive from the Trump administration to drop these cases, which we have not seen yet. And I think in the future, if there's a Democrat who's ever elected president, I think that that we could be right back where we started, where hundreds of companies and hundreds of individuals are looking at criminal charges. But for the time being, the U.S. attorney's offices around the country seem to be exercising some discretion on which cases are dismissed and why they're dismissed. And frankly, we believe that all the cases for Clean Air Act tampering on the criminal side or conspiracy to tamper should be dismissed because those cases are not well founded in law. There is not a clear-cut legal theory under the Clean Air Act for felony charges on mobile sources, and we really believe that those cases are not criminal cases, that they're civil cases. And yeah, if the government wants to sue you or they want to impose a fine or they want to investigate you, then fine. But people should not have to plead guilty to a felony for this.
Hey, diesel fans, I wanted to chat with you about diesel fuel. It's something we've talked about a lot on the podcast, and specifically ways that it can lead to a lot of costly repairs. And the main reason that we have these issues is a lack of lubricity. Our friends over at Hotshot Secrets have developed a formula that boosts performance and then addresses this issue. So whether you have an old truck, new one, something anywhere in between, we all face this issue. Hotshot's EDT is a 6-in-1 formula. It cleans injectors, boosts cetane, and it has 4 times the lubricity as their leading competitor. So it's a great way to be able to stay ahead of the maintenance curve, avoid those costly repairs, and the best part is it does the work for you. So all you do is add it to your regular fuel up schedule, and it's doing all the heavy lifting. So you don't have to worry about some of those issues that just come with diesel fuel anytime we buy it from the pump. If you go to hotshotsecret.com, use code DIESELPOD20. It'll get you 20% off your order. We really appreciate the team and our friends over at Hotshot Secret offering this discount code just for you guys. So if you're in the market, head on over to their website, use code DIESELPOD20 and get 20% off your order. Common question we get from you guys a lot is, hey, I need a diesel engine. I either, I can't wait this long to get one, or normal place I get stuff from it just takes too long, or they don't have the parts in it that I need. Maybe my truck's not stock, or I tow heavy with it. I don't want to go back with just a stock engine. DFC Diesel is a sponsor of the podcast. We worked with them, hand in hand on doing episodes, answering technical questions. They have a complete lineup of Cummins, Duramax, and Power Stroke remanufactured engines that are set to a standard of ISO 9001 2015 standards, which is a huge deal in the aftermarket. And there's certain levels of quality testing, validation that are required for that. So when you get one of those engines, the type of quality that's built behind it with an industry-leading warranty that's really comprehensive. And the other thing with that is sometimes the options that are out there, it's a basic OEM engine. You want a little bit more. You don't want to have the same failure again. So there's a bunch of different series of engines that they have, from core, street, tow haul, and also the Speed of Air series, which we've covered on the podcast before. There's a lot of really cool benefits to it. And if you have questions about that, reach out to them. If you don't know the type of engine that you're looking for, if you go to dfcdiesel.com, there's a ton of info there. You can send an email or you can reach out to them. Also, they're working with Speed of Air pistons, which it's the only piston that pays for itself. And there's a lot of really cool technology behind it. So you can add that into your build and be able to get better fuel economy, increase power, increase torque, and better engine life out of it. Some of the most common engine applications or series of engines that they have with that lead time, a lot of them are in stock or they have really short lead times. So you can check your favorite retailer or go to dfcdiesel.com, check them out, see what's in stock, see what you can get. If you have questions, maybe you want to do something that's outside of the normal series of engines, they have tons of choices for rods, cranks, pistons, valve train upgrades, tons of different things. So if you're in the market, definitely make sure and head on over and check them out. We were talking a little bit before the podcast about the agricultural side, which you had mentioned that Trump had mentioned something in a press conference or something like that, where he talked about agricultural equipment and what his goals were to alleviate some of the strain on that. Can you share a bit about more about that?
Yeah, this is a really interesting development that I don't know what's going to happen on this. Frankly, I don't know what kind of power Trump or the Trump administration have to do this, legally speaking. But when Trump was announcing a relief bill for farmers around the country, a $12 billion relief bill, he made a comment in his press conference where he said that he was going to lift the requirement for tractors and other agricultural equipment to have emissions controls on them, because the emissions controls were making it difficult for the farmers to do their job. I don't know if this is marketing. I don't know if President Trump was exaggerating or if he was telling the truth. It's kind of hard to tell sometimes, frankly. But if what he said was true, and he was and he really is going to lift the requirements related to SCR systems and DPF systems and things like that on tractors and other agricultural equipment, it would really be a massive boon to people who are being charged under tampering theory. Because if you're being charged for tampering, but the administration is saying that if you have a tractor or other farm equipment, then you don't have to have the emissions controls on your vehicle, that gives us a lot of really good arguments to say that mobile source tampering should not be a felony. So I think we're all kind of waiting to hear a little bit more on that, and I'm hoping it wasn't just an off-the-cuff remark by the Trump administration or by President Trump himself, and that he does intend to take steps to remove emissions controls on tractors, but that will remain to be seen.
Is a tractor considered the same as a passenger or light duty truck that's used on state and federal roads? They're considered the same thing.
They are considered the same thing, meaning that they are in the same title for the Clean Air Act. If a tractor or another vehicle is moving, or it is able to be mobile, it's got wheels, it can drive around, then that is a mobile source.
Okay.
Stationary sources are things where it would be impossible for them to move. It would be like a power plant or an oil refinery or something like that, a big like offshore oil rig where you're emitting diesel fumes, and then you can monitor the exact constitution of the emissions as part of your monitoring device. So tractors don't have a monitoring device on them that would permit any regulator to determine what the actual constitution is of the emissions controls, or I'm sorry, the emissions composition. And so therefore it's a mobile source that can move around.
So that's where it would go back to that kind of equal application of the law, where if they're both mobile sources and one doesn't need it, but this other type of vehicle does,
Hmm.
where it would get very interesting.
And what's an off-road farm vehicle, right? I mean, people are using semis at construction sites around the country that aren't operated on highways that are mobile sources of pollutants or emissions, but also might not be technically agricultural. What about farmers who have a 2015 Dodge that they use as a farm truck that never goes on the highway, but they drive it around their farm all day long?
Yeah.
Like what's the difference between that and a tractor? What if you're using a vehicle to tow items around your farm that where you really need the reliability that comes with not having the emissions controls on? All of these are really good questions that I think need some clarification from the Trump administration or Congress or both.
It seems like in all the conversations we've had throughout the years, this is probably the most change I think we've discussed. A lot of times it's
Definitely.
been more like reporting what's taking place, what's happening, but there seems to have been a lot of change in actuality, in reality, with either cases being dropped, pardons happening. That was that wasn't on my bingo card for
Yeah.
like 2025 is
I
to
mean, there's a lot of pardons happening, right? Like what who really knows what happens with a pardon? We hope that President Trump is giving pardons to people like Troy Lake who are highly deserving of those pardons and that he will continue to do that. But I think like the beauty of a pardon is that there's no oversight and President Trump can do whatever he wants. So, if he feels sympathy or, feels like somebody has been unfairly prosecuted, I think that there's a possibility that that person could get a pardon.
I'm definitely not qualified in any way, shape, or form to determine what is weaponization or not. But I know that a lot of people that own companies in this industry listen to our episodes, and some of them have probably been directly affected, had cases, and they're going to be curious, like, how does the pardon process work, or how can I become involved in, like you mentioned, Levi wanting to be involved in the community and the industry and do
Hmm.
things. How can like what do you do? How do you proceed with that? What if you had a case 3 or 4 years ago, you served time or something like that, you feel
Yeah.
like it was weaponized against you? What do you do next?
So I think it really depends on the person and what kind of efforts they want to make to get a pardon. The first convictions in cases like these were happening in like 2021 and 2022. So they're all pretty recent. And I think what you probably want to do if you want to get involved is we're hoping that there's going to be like a committee or a group of people who's going to evaluate, putting together uh, pardon applications, almost like a nonprofit, but I wouldn't say technically filed as a nonprofit to, help with that process. It's just Troy's pardon just happened, what, 3 weeks ago or maybe 1 month ago, and everybody is kind of reeling from the possibility that you might be able to get a pardon, what you can do. So they're always welcome to reach out to me, and I'm not going to promise to respond if I get, 10,000 emails about pardons, but I would certainly take a look at, the people who are sending it over and, what kind of funds they have available to pay, whether or not they're a good candidate to pay and or I'm sorry, not to pay, a good candidate to receive a pardon. And then, we get the other people in the industry like Troy and Levi involved to see what's possible and go from there. It's just all in really early stages because the Troy Lake pardon and the Levi Crash dismissal just came out, and so we don't really know how to process it yet.
One of the things I'm really passionate about when I have these conversations with you is I want somebody to listen or watch it and for them to get the most clear, concise picture they can because in with like YouTube or TikTok or other platforms, this news will break and then somebody will run with it and say, there's pardons for deletes. You can do what you want. Don't worry about it. But I know in
Yeah,
actuality, somebody is going to deal with, I don't even know the emotional and mental and even spiritual stress that happens when you face a felony federal charge
yeah,
and they're sitting in your office talking with you and they're potentially losing their business and the strain it puts on their family and all those sorts of things. I hope that through these conversations, people can maybe pause for a second and contact somebody like yourself or you directly and say,
sure.
what do I do? So I love to cover these in this kind of detail. I know people love to like, with podcasts, there's like two different kinds of listeners. Somebody wants an answer in 30 seconds or less, and somebody won't watch if it's under
Yeah.
10 minutes because they want the details and they want the information. So I think it's really important to be able to cover these things in detail. Well, something I wanted to ask you before we wrap up, I think it's
Hmm.
kind of related, but I got this question a lot over the summer. Emissions rollbacks. And
Yeah.
the perception is it rolling back to a previous year, 2007, 2003. Who even knows what it is? But we heard Lee Zeldin talk about it, the EPA, the director of the EPA, discuss that. What does that actually mean? And I think it's important as we look towards the future because we've talked about how when an administration changes, their priorities change, what they want to enforce, what they're
Yeah.
politically following can affect the law and its enforcement. And so we're wondering, okay, if we're going to roll back to a previous
I mean,
year
your
range,
guess is as good as mine, man. Like the here's the problem with all the news and the sound bites on the emissions rollbacks is that the actual rollbacks that are happening with the EPA are positive developments, and they're definitely pro energy, pro business rollbacks, but they are they have to go through the legal process to be rolled back, and that goes through formal rulemaking, like we were talking about before. And to a lot of our listeners or your listeners who happen to be listening to me, they don't necessarily have to do with emissions controls or diesels. So, for example, they're going to roll back the fuel efficiency standards that were created or imposed under the Biden administration that said OEMs have to achieve a certain net fuel efficiency for all the vehicles that they make by a certain year. So by 2035, the entire line of Chevrolet vehicles or General Motors vehicles must achieve 18 miles to the gallon. I don't know what the number is. I'm making that up, but that's the gist of it. Okay. So one way that you achieve these rollbacks is you make a lot more EVs because though they have zero emissions, right? So if you make a lot more EVs, then you don't have to improve the mileage requirements for your more fuel inefficient vehicles like diesel trucks or whatever it may be. Well, the EPA and the Trump administration are going to roll back the net fuel requirements for that were imposed under the Biden administration or other or under other previous administrations. So the fuel requirements that you have to meet by 2030 and 2035 and 2040 are not there anymore, or they're going to be dramatically changed. That doesn't really help the emissions related or tampering related or diesel related questions that you and I face on a daily basis, but it makes for a really good soundbite. So it's like, oh, they're rolling back all the fuel efficiency requirements. Maybe they're going to make deletes illegal. That's not the way it works. The other one that I hear very frequently that you and I have talked about before is the carbon dioxide, the CO2 emission standard, right? Under the emissions, the federal endangerment finding, the EPA's endangerment finding that they made in 2009, I think that's the year, they said carbon dioxide is a danger to the public. and these other pollutants are dangerous to the public. And so, under the basis for that finding, we are going to require that businesses and manufacturers and oil refineries and other, companies reduce their CO2 output. You have to reduce the amount of CO2 that you put out into the environment. Okay, well, CO2 is not really a problem for diesels. I mean, yes, there is CO2 that's emitted for diesels, but really the pollutants that are addressed by diesel emission equipment are NOx and particulate. And there's been no change in tailpipe emission standards for NOx or particulate. So is there going to be? Maybe. And does the EPA look like it wants to reduce the regulations on these pollutants that are going into the air or that may be going to the air? Definitely. But we don't have any real solid answer on the emissions rollbacks or the CO2 rollbacks or the fuel efficiency standards as it might directly relate to diesels or emissions controls on diesels yet. Hopefully, we will get some progress on NOx and particulate relatively soon.
It's interesting. Yeah, I think it's something I come back to the side of how quickly things can change, how quickly those fuel economy standards were set and how they can be changed. And I think it makes it really tough in a business perspective as well, because you're planning out 5 to 10 years, and how do you accommodate that? Which the buying public, the truck owner, the enthusiast, they're the recipients of what these companies produce. It's still very much clouded or kind of up in the air as to what happens. But like I said, this is the first time in years of chatting with you where I've seen an actual movement on these things, and some of the stuff we heard earlier in the year come to fruition. I did want to have an opportunity here as we wrap this up for people who listen and things that you're working on with other people in the legal sphere. If they want to connect with you, if they have questions, whether it be about pardons or how to just become involved in what's taking place, how can they connect with you guys?
Yeah, they can go to our website and they can email me. It's Stewart, Stewart, at HassanCables.com, HassanCables.com. Email is the best way to get a hold of me. You can try to call me, but I'm probably not going to pick up if I don't recognize your number or I don't think you're the court calling me. If I see no ID on there, usually it's coming from a court and I might have to pick that up. But if you want to email me, I would encourage your listeners not to be offended if I don't respond. It's not because I don't care about your question. It's just because I got a lot of work and a lot of clients, and I want to make sure that I'm prioritizing that. And I will promise to get back to as many of your listeners as I can, especially people who have got convictions for diesel tampering or conspiracy types of cases, or it doesn't even have to be in the diesel world, any kind of weaponization case. We're looking at really closely people who have been, people who have been charged with violating any kind of a federal law, or they've been sued under any kind of a federal law for theories that don't seem to be a priority for the Trump administration. We're looking really closely at those weaponization cases as cases to take to Congress or to take to an appeal or maybe to get set aside. And I think yours is the only podcast I do, Patrick. And the reason for that is because your listeners are really respectful and you've got a really, really great listener base with really good reach. And I want to not dilute my message that I have for my potential clients or for my existing clients. So anybody who's been subject to these kind of weaponization arguments that we've been talking about today, I'd be happy to talk to. Just send me an email and I'll get back to you as soon as I can.
Very cool. Well, I appreciate you meeting with me today and providing some clarity and some feedback on what you're seeing out there. If I don't chat with you before Christmas, New Year's, hope you have a great holiday, a great Christmas. and I'm sure we will chat next year. Things seem to be changing rapidly, but our audience is very keyed in on wanting to get this information, and I know they appreciate your time and experience with it. And I really enjoyed chatting with you today, Stuart.
Yeah, my pleasure, and happy holidays and happy Merry Christmas to you and your family, and to your listeners as well. And we'll be in touch and just keep trying to move forward.
Don't forget, Diesel fans, make sure and head on over to kershaw.kaiusa.com. Use code 20 TDP 2026 to get 20% off your cart. It's a great way to save some money, get some cool gear if you're in the market for a new EDC knife, something for hunting, fishing, around the job site, or around the house. They've got you covered with a bunch of different choices for blade steel, blade shape, different handle designs, different opening mechanisms, and their whole lineup's designed to meet any budget that you might have. So again, if you're in the market, head on over to kershaw.kaiusa.com and use code 20 TDP 2026 for 20% off your shopping cart. Also want to give a shout out to some of our Patreon supporters: Robert, TSW Diesel, Brian, John, all of our other Patreon supporters, all of you who subscribe on YouTube and podcast apps, follow us on social media. We appreciate all your support here in year 9 of the Diesel Podcast and look forward to bringing you more of the content that you want to hear in 2025. Till next time, keep the shiny side up.